What's up, everybody? This conversation you're about to hear was recorded last Friday, April 17th, and released on the premium subscriber feed last Monday, and I'm releasing it now for regular listeners of the podcast. I'm going to take lessons from how I did this episode and try to apply them to all of the stuff that I put out, because I really did like the tone and looseness of the conversation. And I think that's because I wasn't going off some rigid rundown or template. It's the Grant Williams approach, so it worked. I took a lesson out of Grant's playbook. And by the way, shout out to Grant, who is back on the podcast airways with his new podcast, eponymously named The Grant Williams Podcast, rocketing up the charts on Apple Podcast with its gorgeous jacket art. Tomorrow, as usual, there's going to be another weekly episode released. We're back on a regular schedule until further notice. I know I released a bunch of extra episodes last month when markets were going haywire, but for now, we're back on schedule. So enjoy. And please, if you're a fan of the show and you have not reviewed us yet on Apple Podcast, please take a moment to do that now. I know I've said this many times, it's part of the pre-roll, but it really does help other people find the show. And you can do it straight from your phone as you're listening to the podcast. I'm not normally an advocate of multitasking. I think we could all benefit from a little more focus. But in this case, you're doing me and other potential listeners a great service. So please, if you haven't done it yet, there's never going to be a better time than right now. And with that, please enjoy this special release of my premium episode with Castle Island Ventures partner, Nic Carter. What's up, everybody? What you're about to hear is an experiment in conversation, something I didn't prepare for, that I recorded with Nic Carter on Friday, April 17th. Nic is a partner at Castle Island Ventures, a Cambridge, Massachusetts-based venture fund focused on seed-stage investments in public blockchain startups. He's also the co-founder and chairman of Coinmetrics, a blockchain analytics company, and he's a regular columnist at CoinDesk, where he writes thoughtfully about the political economy and issues concerning Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency market. Nic's been on the show before. He was my guest on episode 97. He's thoughtful, he's interesting to talk to, and I like him. So he was one of a few people that I felt comfortable bringing on to shoot the shit about the world, about markets, Bitcoin, whatever. I've wanted to do more episodes like this, especially lately, since so many people are cooped up in their homes. But it's also because it's a lot of work for me to produce a regular episode. So much goes into it. So I like the idea of doing more casual type stuff, where I bring on one or more guests and we talk about whatever's topical or just riff on stuff that's in the news or on our minds. This fits that description. Neither of us prepped for this conversation. I literally emailed Nic earlier in the day and proposed that we do something, and later that afternoon, we hopped on a call and we did it. And it turned out to be a great conversation. I mean, you'll notice we're more relaxed, it's more conversational, and we cover so many interesting topics. I'm really happy with how it turned out. And I'm really happy with how the subscription model has turned out. Just today, we surpassed 1,000 premium subscribers, and I cannot tell you guys how happy I am that we stuck to this model. The last 15 days alone, we've added over 150 new subs, which means that not only have all of you continued to support the production of this podcast during what has been an enormously difficult period, but that even more people are signing up, and they are doing it in record numbers. So that says to me that we are doing something right. If you like what you're about to hear, then I want to hear from you. I want you to tweet at me, comment on the Patreon post, write a podcast review, however you want to express your feelings and thoughts about the program and this model of relying on each and every one of us to fund the continued evolution of this podcast. I encourage you to share the episode and to encourage others to subscribe to the premium content. This is the model for an audience like ours. And the more people who subscribe, the more resources I have to take this podcast to the next level. And with that, please enjoy this experiment in conversation with my guest, Nic Carter. Nic Carter, welcome to the inaugural episode of the Overtime feed.
All right, happy to be here. And thanks for inviting me back on.
Yeah. I mean, I make it sound like it's some official feed, but, well, I mean, it is the Overtime feed, but I tried the last few days, and it's not the first time I've tried doing this, to just sit in front of the microphone and talk and kind of give my thoughts about what I think's been going on or what I think is interesting, and I can talk for a while, but I never know how to end it. I never know how to stop. And at the end, I was like, yeah, maybe I just need to invite some people on who I think are interesting or have interesting views, and we can just talk instead.
Well, here I am, and I have opinions. So.
Where are you at, man? You're in Boston, right?
No, I left Boston. I fled. Yeah, so I live in downtown Boston. I kind of figured Boston would be the epicenter of a lot of this stuff, and it sort of has been.
Because of the college students?
Yeah, they had this big biotech conference, which caused a bit of a crisis, and I just didn't want to be in a densely packed urban area. So I'm in the suburbs of DC right now, which is much more pleasant.
All right, that's where you're from, Virginia, right? Or something like that?
Well, where I'm from is complicated, but yeah, this is where I've spent most of my life.
Right, because if our memory serves, you did your bachelor's degree in Edinburgh.
Master's, yeah. My undergrad was just up the road at St. Andrews in Scotland.
And one of the degrees was in philosophy and the other one was in foreign affairs?
So undergrad was joint philosophy and IR, and then master's was in finance.
Oh, that's interesting. So what was it exactly in finance? Because I don't remember this.
It was like a very quantitative course. It was called MSc Finance. So involved lots of data. That was actually when I got the idea to start Coinmetrics. So that's where Coinmetrics began.
So remind our listeners a little bit, because people, even though this is a bit of a conversation, just so listeners that are coming, first of all, when was it when you were originally on Hidden Forces?
Would have been summer of last year, maybe.
Was it? Was it that? Let's see here. Looks about right.
I don't know if I remember correctly.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So that was mostly about Bitcoin. You had Pierre Richard on the show before.
I did, who's blocked me on Twitter months ago.
That's a shame. I'll never block you, don't worry.
I know. I told him I don't negotiate with terrorists. No, I can't remember. I don't know if he blocked me after I said that or if he'd already blocked me and someone asked me what happened and I said I don't negotiate with terrorists. But no, I know. It's fine. It's weird because he was on the show and there's no good reason to block me other than, I'm not even an anti.
Yeah,
Bitcoin person.
You always struck me as pretty crypto proximate, if not sympathetic to the objectives. So
listen, man, speaking frankly, I just like talking to people who have interesting things to say. And in terms of like ideologically speaking, I used to be an ideological person. I think ideologies are ways of being intellectually lazy. And there was a time when I was, I think, intellectually lazy. But, I think the reality is that there's no condition in which relying on a template is the ideal way to go through life. I do think that,
right.
Again, if that's what you've got, that's what you've got. And then there are some templates that are better than others. But, at some point you got to break with that and you have to start introducing new stuff in. But yeah, you were a phenomenal guest, unsurprisingly. I knew you were going to be. Yeah, no, you were going to be great. Yeah, you were smacking between Raoul Paul, who's always popular anywhere he goes. Yeah, he's like one of those guys that just blows up your feed. And David Webb, which was also a great episode. So, and you were, surrounded by a bunch of, we were on a roll at that time. Yeah. So, that was a great episode. I so much enjoyed talking with you. And so tell our audience a little bit about who you are, just to give them a refresher. Yeah.
So the episode was good because, I try to make the case for Bitcoin or the existence of Bitcoin without being too dogmatic about it, So I find myself fighting with the Bitcoiners a lot, even though I consider myself one. But yeah, more generally, professionally, I'm a VC. So I work for a venture fund. We do early stage startup investments for the most part within the crypto industry, although that means we're investing in equity, not in tokens. I generally take a really dim view of investing in tokens, especially the more speculative stuff, some of which resembles unregistered securities. I'm also the co-founder of a blockchain analytics startup called Coinmetrics, which just raises Series A. And the objective there is to demystify the usage of blockchains so that normal folks could get a better understanding of what's going on them. And I think of it a little bit like taking satellite pictures of Walmart parking lots so that you can infer information about the economy. That's the thing I really like about public blockchains is that they are pretty transparent. And if you do a little bit of work, you can figure out what the key features of them are. You can find that macroeconomic data, although we're still in the discovery phase. So that's what I spend most of my time doing. And I also write about, for the most part, the political economy of blockchains. People describe them as these totally amoral, these automatons which just take inputs and produce outputs in a really mechanistic way. And that's true to a degree. That's certainly part of the teleology of public blockchains like Bitcoin. That's what they're meant to do. But they don't always do that. There is a degree of subjectivity and human oversight and governance. And I'm pretty interested in that because folks in the crypto industry have a habit of trying to hide the fact that there is human discretion in these systems, because they really want to draw strong contrasts with the existing financial system. And I'm interested in the truth as opposed to taking a side, even though I am on one side, clearly. So I try and do a little bit to expose the fact that, yes, there is human discretion. They're not fully decentralized. I'm sympathetic to some of those skeptical schools of thought.
So what's it been like to be in the Bitcoin community these days? Like, how have people in crypto, Bitcoin, I don't know how much they differentiate amongst themselves. The Bitcoin community has become a more prominent community in the media. Like, for example, Bitcoin podcasts have become the dominant form of podcasts. And like a lot of the crypto stuff that was there early on in like 2017 when I sort of got into the space, a lot of those are just really dropped off the map. It's quite remarkable. One in particular I'm thinking of that was like very, very popular. I don't hear much about it anymore. So I don't know how those two communities mix, but how has that overall community dealt with or interpreted what's been going on in the broader economy these days?
Well, the probably number one thing that's happened is this feature of Bitcoin that was the case historically is not the case today. And it's caused a lot of anxiety and gnashing of teeth. And I'm referring to the correlation between Bitcoin and traditional financial assets. So from 2010, when Bitcoin first got a market price, to January 2020, Bitcoin was completely uncorrelated from virtually any financial asset you can think of in terms of its return profile. And its correlation with the S&P 500, never entered any meaningful positive zone. And that was touted as a really great attribute to have, right? It's like, oh, maybe this thing is a really powerful portfolio diversifier. However, in mid-March, when there was this rush to liquidity, there's this really sudden sell-off in financial assets, Bitcoin and crypto as a whole was not exempt from that and sold off really, really rapidly at the same time. And those correlations rose to levels they'd never been before and stayed there. So Bitcoin has kind of moved in lockstep with the S&P 500 for the last couple of months, which is really shocking, actually. And it has defanged one of the bullish narratives for Bitcoin, which is that it's a really excellent portfolio diversifier. Maybe it's even a safe haven. So that is not the case. And there's some consternation over that. I did feel that it was a bit of a poison chalice, or it was a risky narrative to spin, because you can't stop an asset becoming more correlated, especially as it becomes more financialized, which it has been. So to some degree, it was to be expected that the correlations would rise over time. But yeah, so one of Bitcoin's key narratives has been dented really thoroughly. So even though Bitcoiners right now are like pretty ardent that there's like some extreme monetary mischief going on, out there in the hands of central banks, Bitcoin itself has had a bit of a narrative setback for sure. And I would say that's actually caused a lot of people that might otherwise have had a position to reconsider it. So it's being pulled in two directions right now.
So the Bitcoin community is heavily influenced by the Austrian school. There are people like you who are more nuanced, but I think this has probably played a role in a lot of the confusion in the community, it seems to me, around what you call monetary mischief, i.e., for shorthand, the printing of money or the expansion of the Fed balance sheet and the creation of Federal Reserve note liabilities and the expansion of the monetary base and the lack of immediate inflation. Where is the community in terms of its intellectual development when it comes to economics?
Yeah, as you say, it's heavily Austrian in nature and monetarist, So inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon, right? And there is certainly a bit of confusion as to why apparently there has been no inflation in response to this extreme monetary issuance. But of course, the denominator is changing as well. There's been a deflationary shock. And also there's been a rush for dollars globally, as most debts are dollar denominated. So it's not that eminently surprising that there hasn't been inflation, because I guess the deflationary impulse, very much outweighs the issuance. There's definitely a feeling that inflation may yet recur if we enter a political regime where entitlements grow and barriers to that spending disappear over time. Maybe the economy recovers, but the extremely high rate of spending stays high. That would be the circumstance that I think where it is plausible that we could get a reprise of inflation. But yeah, the fact that we haven't had any has also definitely been a source of certainly confusion or sort of amazement in the Bitcoin community. To be fair, I don't think there's any one school of thought that really does a perfectly good job of explaining where we are from a monetary perspective right now.
Definitely
It seems like the MMT school maybe has the upper hand.
Sectoral balance view of money.
Yeah, there's no apparent consensus right now over what's going to happen. Can we fully monetize the debt?
Yeah, that's a bizarre. I actually literally tweeted out today. See if I can find exactly what it was. I was reading through the Financial Times. I contacted you this morning sometime to see if you wanted to come on. You said sure. And then I was like, let me take a cursory look at the news headlines and see if there's anything interesting out there. And there was an article by the Financial Times highlighting, it was an interview or some sort of feature of Stephanie Kelton, who is kind of the face of modern monetary theory, who is out with a new book. It's coming out sometime, I think, this summer.
Good timing.
Yeah, maybe. I think it would have done well if it came out last year also. I don't know. What do you think would be a good time for MMT? Because that is an interesting question. What sort of external environment would be most habitable for MMT? But I read it, and I tweeted out, let's all get prefrontal lobotomies. And I can't say that it was a well thought out thing, but what I think I meant was just basically like, when I read MMT, like there are parts that make sense, and then there are other parts that make zero sense, like the example being replacing open market operations and reverse repos with the IRS and taxes. So, i.e., if you want to reduce the money supply, just raise taxes, as opposed to conduct monetary policy. It's like obsessive compulsive, kind of hyper-focused and missing the bigger picture. That's how I interpret MMT. But I'm curious when you think would be a good time for MMT, because it seems, for me, MMT is a political thing, first of all. It's really not an attempt to understand the economy.
Well, I think it's misunderstood. I'm not an MMT fan by any means. I think there's a descriptive element and then the prescriptive element.
Yeah.
And, the descriptive element I actually find to be somewhat compelling. It's certainly a curious inversion of many concepts that I thought were true and that I learned in my undergrad, economics classes. The fact that it's loans that create deposits in banks, for instance, and that taxes are a tool to check inflation. It's very interesting to me. And it seems to me like we're in this curious half measure world right now where we've gone from a world of ostensive, fiscal restraint and a monetary authority that was unwilling to fully monetize the debt. And now we're in this in-between space where, in reaction to this staggering crisis and a leader who is politically not too beholden to, the old school of conservatism, and two parties that aren't really interested in fiscal conservatism, we've entered this MMT proximate regime. We're not fully there yet. The Fed isn't directly financing the economy. There's still this notion of federal debt and so on. And there's still a theory about being repaid at some point. But if you look at the Bank of England, for instance, England is financing their expenditures with monetary issuance now. Obviously, Japan has been doing somewhat related experiment for a long time. It does seem to me that we might as well just go to the logical conclusion here, because I don't think there's a way back. Realistically, I don't think we're ever going to have a politician able to reimpose fiscal conservatism. It seems like a quaint idea. And now we have a lot of pundits wondering, well, if this was possible, if we could have untethered issuance like this without apparent inflationary effects, why weren't we doing it before? Like, what social programs went unfinanced because we had this excessive conservatism? That seems to me to be the current orthodox view.
So I have a lot of thoughts about that. I completely agree that there is a prescriptive component of MMT and there is a descriptive. And the descriptive component is, I think, great. And it offers a much better view of how a monetary system operates than Austrian theory does, because Austrian theory is so much based on a gold-backed monetary system, which is not what we have today. So I think in that sense, I agree. I don't agree, though, with the idea that taxes can be a viable mechanism by which to reduce inflation. That seems, just asinine.
Yeah.
It's like you're going from like airplane to going by camel. Like, how does that work as a better way to do it, right? I mean, it's already imperfect. Inflation is a nonlinear phenomenon, which actually gets me to point number 2, but it's a nonlinear phenomenon. So by the time you see it, the genie's already out of the bottle, potentially. Yeah. So it's bad enough, the mechanisms we use today to try to kind of stop inflation on our heels, but the idea that you're going to raise taxes, and taxes are also so political. That's another aspect as well, which is MMT doesn't seem to take into account, or maybe they do, I don't know. There's only so much of it I can take, but the freedom of action changes when you cohabitate Treasury and the Fed, or if people have the impression that your scale of action is much different. If people think that you can do more, they'll expect for you to do more, and I think that kind of makes it harder for you to curb inflation if you're going to hurt people.
Yeah.
But inflation is nonlinear. That's the other thing. And you don't see it until you see it. And then once you see it, then you're in a whole new paradigm. Then you're in 1970s.
Yeah, and then it's too late almost. Yeah, and that's probably my critique of MMT, which I didn't mention before, is I believe that there's political constraints to it, like very real political constraints. And if you normalize the notion of monetary issuance as a way to finance the economy, then people are probably going to rebel a little bit at the notion of taxes, because they might, at that point, and you see it in the crypto community for sure, people will say, well, why do we have taxes if you can just pay the budget by printing dollars? And it seems like such a strange or like juvenile objection, but I think it's true. You still have to maintain a sense of authority and order to the system. And if you become completely untethered, then it sort of falls apart. And as you say, the other thing is, if you open up the Overton window or like the design space of the government as this ultimate tinkerer which is omniscient and omnipotent and can finance virtually anything, you're always going to get a demand to finance endless entitlements, spending, stimulus, infrastructure, or whatever, even when it's not strictly warranted. And so I think you just enter this terminal cycle of massive expenditure. And I'd say we're in it in terms of, you look at the size of the government spending relative to GDP, it seems to be growing virtually every year. And you depart from having a genuine capitalist economy and you have something that looks more socialist. Not to say that pejoratively, but just the scope of government expenditure and its influence on the economy grows, which I think has this zombifying effect on society, which is really my issue with bailouts, is that effectively you have the government determining what the allocative outcomes are and not the free market.
Yeah, thing that I focused on of all the things that you said was this attempt to describe what our economy is. I guess it depends on how we define terms. Like, is a capitalist economy an economy that has to be strictly a free market in every single way? Well, then, of course, we're not a capitalist economy. Is a socialist economy an economy that's socialistic in every single way, i.e., because the Soviet Union wasn't really communist, it was socialist. The way I learned what communism is in a strict economic sense, it wasn't communism, it was socialism. It was the state owning the means of production. And
there were capitalist elements too, like you had entrepreneurial black market capitalism, right?
Sure. Again, yeah. So there were elements of capitalism within the society, but the structure of the official structure of the economy was socialistic. The pockets of capitalism were the exception to the rule. They sort of manifested as a result of imperfections in the application of the model. But what we have today, it keeps moving in a direction of, again, I don't think it would sort of be correct. We're kind of caught. This is one of those things where we need a new word to describe what we're seeing, because what we've been seeing, and it's something that I've been talking about recently more and more. It's not the first time I've talked about it, but it's been coming back to me because we're in another one of these cycles. The last time we were in one of these cycles was 2008, where there are these, I think you've been writing about this as well. You have these bailouts of the largest corporations, of the preferred interests in the society. And we've had these cycles now a number of times, and I'm curious to hear what your take is on this. I think that what we're really seeing at a top level is that we've seen an accumulation of wealth in a denser proportion of the population, a smaller number of people accumulating more and more of the wealth due to many reasons: regulatory, taxes, technology, globalization. There are lots of factors. And monetary policy has played a role, but it's one of those interesting things where it's also, is it the dog wagging the tail or is it the tail wagging the dog? Because the growth of the wealth gap and the accumulation of wealth in smaller and smaller hands, the only way that can happen and has happened is through debt finance, right? The only way that you can manage that is by the expansion of private sector debt. The expansion of private sector debt can only go on for so long without having to lower interest rates, because the burden of the debt becomes onerous. And so in order to make it carryable, you've got to lower interest rates. And the lowering of interest rates and the expansion of debt causes asset prices to rise. It presses upward pressure on asset prices. And eventually, it becomes harder and harder for people on the sort of outskirts of the wealthy or the savings class, right? If we think about this as sort of the debtors and savers, the savings class, the people on the outside begin to be unable to hold on. It's almost like the centrifuge is, flying around, and they're getting flung off, into the side of the debtors. And eventually, all of these people, the only way that they're able to actually save anything is by putting it to the stock market, which is exactly what's happened. So increasingly, the vast majority of society has to move into the stock market if they could put their money anywhere, if they have any savings. And so now you've turned savers into speculators, and all of these speculators that are invested in the stock market. And the stock market has gone from being a financial utility to what Ben Hunt calls a political utility to now being a political liability. And every time the stock market goes down, it is a fucking crisis. Because if the stock market collapses, people's entire life savings are wiped out because that's where people save their money now, you know?
Yeah.
And on top of that, there are a lot of other factors because the entire economy has now become conditioned on the idea that stocks always go up. And the authorities are invested in this process.
Yeah.
But I don't know, that's my general sort of point of where we're going. So you get to this point where the government effectively has to own the entire market. Because if the market collapses or asset prices drop, that sort of collapses an increasingly core assumption of market participants, which is that the markets will not go down and that the authorities will not allow them to go down. So allowing them to go down would wreck the economy.
And I couldn't agree more, first of all. And this is why I'm so glad you had Mike Green on, who explained the particular mechanisms through which the stock market became a savings device and how Congress encouraged that to occur.
Yeah,
with specific regulation.
Phenomenal.
I learned a lot in that episode. I mean, I'd had an intuition that from the 80s, I would say onwards, America got progressively more financialized, but it was really eye-opening to see how specifically employers were encouraged to funnel their employees into 401ks and treat the stock market like a savings device. I think the outcome of all this is that you have managers, directors of public corporations, the largest corporations, can hold the economy hostage in a sense. They're in a very strong negotiating position, relative to policymakers here. They know that pensions, they have a required rate of return of 6 to 8%.
Yep.
They know that American savers own 401ks. They don't own, CDs or cash. They've been forced through this shadow inflation, in my opinion, far in excess of CPI. They've been forced to hold financial assets, as you say, to become speculators. And then on top of that, you have this cult of passive investing, thanks to this like really warped version of what Bogle was preaching, where, people looked at historical models of stock return from the 1880s to present and decided that the risk premium of equities was 5%, plus inflation. You had this sort of guaranteed return of 7% real, 9% nominal over the last 100 years, and that you were guaranteed to acquire or to achieve this return regardless of your starting position as long as you held equities for long enough. And I just think that's totally nonsense. I think we're going to find out over the next decade as we have this unwinding of leverage that that's not true, that your starting position matters, the valuations matter. When you buy a security, you're buying a claim on cash flows, and the amount of cash flows that you're purchasing per unit of price, I guess, that actually matters. You can't just blindly pile into the asset. But as Mike Green said, since we had this rotation into public equity, it structurally became a bigger part of the American saver of their portfolio. That also juiced returns, and it encouraged people to pursue this strategy. So you have the parabola gets steeper and steeper as people reevaluate their expectations based on the prior performance. So that's where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, his insights on passive, for me, they've moved the needle more than anything else that I've learned in the last so many years. I compare them to reading Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism and having her on the show in terms of what that did for me as far as data privacy and surveillance and the differentiating between technology and the logic, the economic logic that animates the technology, that it did the equivalent of that, but for finance. I think Logica tries to position itself to capitalize also on a melt up, which may well come prior to any meltdown. It's about this idea of flows. The flows are dominating increasingly the price movements, and that nothing else matters. What simply matters is, do I have cash? If so, then buy.
Yeah. I think we might be in the midst of a melt up right now, actually. Yeah. You contrast the performance of financial assets with the apparent reality, and there's a huge contrast. Some people are outraged by this. They say, how dare the stock market go up? But to me, it's just a sign of the times. If we're reflating this bubble, probably we have some ways to go. But I'm still of the school of thought, especially in my discipline where your entry price really matters. We can't afford, the venture math doesn't work if you're overpaying you just fundamentally can't achieve the IRR that LPs expect if you're massively overpaying. So from our point of view, we're very sensitive to valuations. Sorry about that. That's my dog.
It's all right.
We're very sensitive to pricing. And I think public equity investors should be as well. But you really rarely hear people talk about PE ratios anymore. It's a much more automatic thing. It's like, as you say, I got my paycheck, so I'm going to put it into the stock market.
So what do you think the interesting story is? Like, what do you think people will be talking about in the fall?
Well, I think it'll still be the lingering effects of the virus. I don't think that's going to be, I doubt it's going to be a short-term snap back to normalcy.
Well, I mean, it's an important, like, it's obviously a great point that you're making, because there's a huge chunk of the economy that needs things to be normal in order to function. And not just the airlines. I mean, I use Greece as a classic example because they've done a phenomenal job of containing the spread, which is essential for Greece, not only because it has an impaired hospital system as a legacy of its recent prolonged crisis, but also because it's a tourist economy that depends on people not being afraid to go there because they're going to catch coronavirus, right? So I think 25% of Greece's economy is tourism, right? That's enormous. But the problem is, if people aren't going anywhere, then there's no tourism economy. So, how long can Greece as a country, as a sort of paradigmatic example, exist without going into economic collapse and political chaos in this environment?
Yeah, it's not a good thing to be that exposed to tourism, obviously. Well, when a tail event like this comes around, I am optimistic that our technological tools will give us some solutions here, whether it's an effective treatment, a vaccine faster than we expected, extremely accurate sensing, warning, maybe more sophistication in the tracing. I'm partial to biology, Srinivasan school of thought that we're going to get red zones and green zones. So we'll get areas where policymakers are fundamentally better or, more prepared to take extreme measures to stamp out incidents of the virus locally. And then to preserve that advantage, they'll want to close their local borders or keep them extremely regimented. And I think it'll happen on a state-by-state basis, probably in the US, maybe even, city-by-city basis. Definitely going to happen on a country-by-country basis. So unfortunately, I think travel is going to be very much impaired for the foreseeable future. And, there's definitely even a more extreme version of that take where we look back on the period 1990 to 2020 and think that was a historical aberration in terms of being able to travel in a truly unencumbered way globally, right? Because, the Soviet Union prevented free travel. China was closed for a long time. And maybe that was the last time we had truly globalized travel.
That's such an interesting point. Because I thought about it from the economic point of view, that airfare became very cheap over a prolonged period of time, and this crisis might potentially put a cap on that. But you're making another really great point, which is the opening up of the Soviet Union, especially the Soviet Union. I mean, people could travel to China in the 80s. I mean, they probably needed some kind of, special visas or something. But, well, I mean, I guess people could also travel to the Soviet Union, though I think it was harder to go to the Soviet Union than it was to go to China, correct?
China was only meaningfully opened in 71, right?
Oh, yeah.
If I'm getting that right. And then the Soviet Union was much later in 89. Obviously, there was a lot of chaos. You probably didn't want to be in the former Soviet Union for a while there.
Yeah,
probably
Bill
at least
Browder.
until 92. I actually wrote my undergrad thesis on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That was a really bloody conflict that actually helped catalyze the collapse of the Soviet Union. People don't know that, really. That was one of the first nationalist movements, and that kicked off all these other local nationalist movements in those Soviet nations, I guess.
In the Caucasus and the Balkans?
Yeah, and you had Georgia, had their kind of irredentist movement. The Baltics were early. Then you had Central Asia, you had Ukraine. So it was like this cascade. And the final stages of the Soviet Union are so interesting. Nobody really expected it to collapse. The US policy, the the diplomacy, the elite in the US, they didn't really have this expectation. And then in the 90s, it was like the decade of jubilation because the US became this unipolar hegemon. But it wasn't like they could really take the credit for the collapse of the Soviet Union. In a sense, they were taken by surprise as well.
Yeah, I mean, Bush famously learned about it on CNN. I had a professor who told us a story about how he was in Berlin right before the fall of the wall, and he was having a conversation with an East German, and he had said, "Oh, you Americans, it's fine. The wall will be here forever." And within a few months, it was down.
Yeah, people don't appreciate how rapidly, fragile systems can fail. I don't think it's likely to happen, but we're seeing states reasserting themselves relative to the federal government. That's happening right now, as we speak.
Yeah.
And I think, it's entirely possible that maybe the Chinese regime they don't have such an iron grip on power that we think they do. There certainly are, regional tensions, especially between the core and the periphery in China. I mean, the world is looking now like it's becoming a, multipolar balance of power once again, but it's eminently plausible to me that we have a new spate of balkanization, and the virus is obviously a very potent catalyst for that in terms of being an accelerant for the localization of the world.
Supply chains, absolutely, too. I mean, we've seen
supply chain, yeah, of course.
I mean, Europe is the one place where it seems most likely to happen. Of course, it could happen in China. If it happened in China, it would be like an atom bomb going off.
Yeah.
The level of tectonic resistance there, or sort of pressure buckling, is so much greater. Or maybe in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But Europe is, on the one hand, it's interesting because I wouldn't describe it as fragile. You could easily describe it as fragile, but there are a lot of strong bonds between the nations in Europe that make it difficult to break this apart. I mean, Macron, the big article on the FT today, I have it right in front of me now, was Macron warns of EU unraveling unless it embraces financial solidarity. Obviously, the French citizens don't want to pay fund the budgets of southern European states, although France's finances aren't as great as Germany's or some of the other nations in Europe. But, I think there is a deep historical commitment to the European project. And I wonder if the Europeans can find a way to hold some semblance of the project together for diplomatic and defense kind of geopolitical reasons, and maybe unbuckle some of the monetary components that make it so difficult, make it so unworkable. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
There's this very popular theory that financial interconnectedness brings political stability, which is going to be tested now.
Yeah.
One of the most popular empirical theories from international relations is this democratic peace theory, which has the implicit component of, free markets, institutional interrelationships, and
democracies never go to war.
Yeah, and there's the humorous corollary, which is no two countries with a McDonald's have ever been to war with each other. And then you look at, the fact that the UK's biggest trade partner before World War I was Germany. And you think, well, it's still possible. And you look at the incredible interconnectedness between the US and China, and you see that relationship unraveling.
Yeah, 100%. Also, the thing about the democracies never going to war, first of all, democracies themselves, the greatest democracy in the country, the United States, has been bombing and going to war with countries for nonstop. So I understand the theory.
With other democracies, though, yeah.
Right. I understand that the theory compares democracies to democracies, but that doesn't make any sense.
I mean, I think what's happening there is democracy has become very popular recently, or maybe it's waning in popularity now, but it had a 100-year bull market. And that coincided with Pax Americana, where America was the sole hegemon or, shared power with the Soviet Union, which that was a stable arrangement. So there just fundamentally wasn't a lot of interstate warfare. There was a lot of intrastate warfare, that's for sure, which that model doesn't really capture. So it might just be like Taleb would say, you just don't have enough data to come to that conclusion. And something like war is fat-tailed. So
yeah. The other point you made about the economic interdependencies being, how did you say it? How did you express that?
That it is believed to be, an inhibitor for conflict, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that was Norman Angel's theory, the Great Illusion before World War I. Obviously, that didn't work out. But
right.
But also, like, it's been the economic interdependence has been at the core of European expansion and integration, right? That was one of the principal assumptions underlying EMU's capacity to expand successfully, which was that economic crises would be causes for further integration. And we're seeing that those were assumption dependent, and under certain assumptions that worked. Also, dude, the other thing that we forget about, and I'm sure you've contemplated, is that the institutions that we live with today, institutions are created during periods of different psychosocial awakenings, and the European Union is very much a bull market project. Certainly EMU.
Right.
EMU was a bull market baby, and the latest phases of EU expansion came during either the full-flown bull market. I mean, I think the Treaty of Nice was 1999, was it? And then the last treaty was before the 2008 crisis, the Lisbon Treaty.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I think institutions get created or entrenched when there is some power shift and the dominant power now has the bargaining power and the ability to, endorse and guarantee an institutional arrangement, which is certainly the case with all the Bretton Woods organizations, post-World War II. And the U.S. is very much pulling back from those obligations. That is unambiguous. And not only that, they are almost rejecting some of those institutions which aren't useful to them because their stature within them has been reduced. The WHO is a great example. The U.S. is by far the largest supporter financially of the WHO, and yet it seems to have been captured or infiltrated, I don't know the right word exactly, by Chinese interests. Look at the popular discourse as it relates to the UN. Americans, for the most part, hate that they have financial obligations to these entities which they feel are not yielding them meaningful benefits. And it may be the case that these aren't providing the returns in terms of soft power that America expects. And I think this next decade is going to bring us the decline of importance in these Bretton Woods organizations. That much is very clear to me, both through their own defanging, through the U.S. pulling back, and through potentially China creating viable alternatives.
Well, you saw that China expelled the New York Times reporters, I think the Washington Post, a bunch of major...
Yeah.
That's one more escalation, or one more... Like, the Cold War was all about building avenues of conversation or contact or discussion to be able to reach the other side.
Yeah.
What we're doing is we're stripping those away one by one. It's quite concerning, dude.
It's very dramatic. Yeah. And it also means that we have no ability to fact check their numbers on the virus, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
I think the next hammer to fall is capital markets relationships between the U.S. and China being severed.
So what does that mean for you?
Well, we have a mostly, U.S. LP base, so it doesn't affect us per se, but it seems to be coming. I think it will occur, actually. And I'm not sure the U.S. is ready, because the U.S. investors have always had this view that they can profit from Chinese growth. And for the most part, that's been wrong. They've been exploited in a number of ways. Chinese companies treated American capital markets like,
piggy banks.
Yeah, a piggy bank. Like, they broke into an arcade and just stole all the toys instead of playing the game you were meant to. it's highly exploitative. We see endless accounting frauds. You see really weak governance. And it's like there's a new high profile accounting fraud every week now, Luckin Coffee just being the most recent one.
Yeah. What's their ticker? LNK or something?
Yeah, something like that. And that was like a super high growth, really exciting
It's like
Chinese
the Starbucks
company.
of China.
And it turns out that hundreds of millions of revenue was just fabricated. And the other thing we see is converse when, Chinese investors take meaningful shares in American companies, they use that for political leverage. We've seen a ton of controversy over that in the last 6 months, which maybe people have forgotten a little bit, but large American media, tech companies being co-opted or being muzzled or being censored due to the existence of, Chinese folks maybe covertly doing the bidding of the CCP, but definitely exporting CCP kind of values, which had a really disastrous collision with the US. I think ultimately there will be a political demand to sever capital markets relationships between these two countries, and US investors are going to have to just come to terms with the fact that no, they can't participate in Chinese growth. They can't profit from it. That was always an impossible dream. It was never going to be allowed. And I think it's going to be obviously really disruptive when it does occur. And there'll be a lot of gnashing of teeth and a lot of really upset investors.
We talked, for listeners who are interested, we talked about this kind of both aspects of these stories with a number of guests, but specifically I'm thinking of Kyle Bass.
Right.
I don't remember what episode that was. I'm trying to find it right now. And then the other one was with Ann Stevenson Yang, who's come on twice. And that's kind of the China hustle, or these companies that have used U.S. capital markets to take out enormous amounts of money and who many of them will default on those loans. And of course, China also owns a huge amount of U.S. debt, and they could begin to sell that, public debt.
Yeah, there's certainly the currency competition element here, although I think the dollar is just so fundamentally dominant globally that there's no risk currently to, the internationalization of the renminbi or something.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny how that was like a big story in 2008, 2009, 2007. Peter Schiff is a good example of someone who talked, I don't know about internationalization of the renminbi, but he's actually a good example of this point about, not to call out Peter, but, he's a kind of very strict Austrian, and he's had a very U.S.-centric focus on the value of the dollar and just looking at it as a one-to-one equation. Like you mentioned, Milton Friedman's quote, inflation is anywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And except it's not, one. Two, other people's monetary policy matters also. And it isn't just monetary policy, it's also the credibility of financial markets, the breadth, depth, and regulatory framework of those markets, the outstanding liabilities denominated in the currency which is being printed, all of those factors matter.
Yeah, and if there's anything we've learned is that the one, universally safe asset in the eyes of investors is the dollar or treasuries. And there's plenty of countries that would love for there to be an alternative to SWIFT or to the kind of New York-centric correspondent banking system and to those U.S. administered financial rails, especially because they politicize them like crazy. They use them for partisan or political objectives, military objectives even. But there just really is no alternative. It's so difficult to bootstrap an alternative because money is the ultimate network effect. So I don't foresee that changing anytime soon. And you're right. I mean, people talk about inflation, U.S. individuals having to bear the cost of inflation, but it's this rapacious foreign demand for dollars, which means that in theory, we can have really extreme levels of issuance and our debt can still be considered attractive. I believe that there are limits to that, might even be reaching those limits soon. There's actually an intersection with crypto here. Something people haven't really noticed is tokenized dollars that circulate on public blockchains, kind of public blockchain infrastructure, for the most part Ethereum, those have swelled in size from about $4 billion at the start of the year to $8.5 billion today. So increasingly, crypto is a rails to give people access to tokenized dollar IOUs, which they can hold outside the banking system. So you even see it in the crypto industry, this insatiable demand for dollars, in particular unencumbered kind of offshore crypto euro dollars.
Yeah, that basically that stable coins are kind of an intermediary for getting access to dollars. That the strength
They're treated like dollars. I've even seen capital markets transactions settling in stable coins on the weekend. You can settle an M&A transaction on the weekend now.
So what's going on in that market? What are the prospects for some of those coins?
Well, the coins like Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're going to follow their own cycle of...
Because you're throwing Bitcoin in there as well, because Bitcoin is also used as an intermediary.
Yeah, so Bitcoin is both a bridge currency because there's exchanges worldwide, right? So there's remittances that occur through the medium of Bitcoin, but they settle in Bitcoin, but they're fiat to fiat remittances, which is interesting. And then both Bitcoin and Ethereum, those networks are used to settle fiat tokens, which move on those rails on top of them. For the most part, they happen on Ethereum. And the biggest one is called Tether, which is kind of got a questionable track record in terms of being fully reserved. So unlike, banks, these stable coins are meant to be fully collateralized. So it's like full reserve banking. In some cases, they're not, which causes a lot of gnashing of teeth and upset, individuals. But it's definitely an underappreciated feature of the crypto industry. And it's probably the number one phenomenon in terms of the way it's going to be disruptive. Because what it means is for the first time, really, you can get access to a digital form of physical banknote offshore, overseas, just through having a smartphone, just by holding, a private public key pair, and without interfacing with any financial institution. You can buy these things on the open market, and there are crypto exchanges in virtually every country. So what it means is if you would normally have to save in your local, inflationary currency, you can now get access to what is, relatively speaking, a hard currency in the dollar, and you can save it outside of your bank. So it's very hard for the government to seize or interfere with. So my guess is this is going to accelerate this process of dollarization in the developing world, especially if you have sovereign defaults. And we're seeing dollarization in Venezuela right now. It wasn't happening for a long time, and then they had a power cut in Caracas, and the only thing that people had to transact with was dollar bills, because you don't really transact in bolivars because inflation outpaced their ability to print new denominations. So people used digital banking rails exclusively. And then there was a big power cut in, Caracas, which was typically insulated from power cuts, and people switched to using their stashes of physical dollars, which they had laying around. And that was the catalyst for it becoming decriminalized to use dollars. And that's what really kicked off the latest spate of dollarization. So it's happening right now.
Let me ask you something else, Nick. This is a kind of a random pivot, but I started listening to a podcast recently that I hadn't heard before. I was familiar with the host. It's Eric Weinstein's podcast, The Portal. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, of course.
Have you been listening to it?
I listened to the one with Peter Thiel. And
that was great.
That
was amazing.
It was a good one. I think that was the first episode.
It was the first episode. Have you heard anything else from his podcast?
No, because I find him to be a bit long-winded.
Yeah. Well, it's he is very, very, very smart. I mean, he is very intellectual. I'm always wary of this kind of general larger idea of, a kind of a counterweight intellectual class. It's almost like, there's one that's being replaced by another, but it really is very good. And one of the things that he talks about in that episode with Peter Thiel, and he talks about it in other ones, so there's a kind of a reason I'm bringing it up, is he talks about this idea of embedded growth obligations. And I'd never heard this before, but it reminded me of a conversation that I had with Jeffrey West and that was episode 19. Jeffrey West was the founder of the high energy physics group at Los Alamos. And our conversation had to do with comparing scaling dynamics and limitations in socioeconomic versus physical systems. And the one system scales quadratically, the other system scales allometrically.
I don't know that one.
Allometric scaling is this type of scaling that you see in economies of scale. So when you add the incremental car to the production line, your costs don't go up linearly, they go up sublinearly.
Right. Yeah.
So your costs decline per unit. And it's a measure of efficiency. So one example of that in the physical world is that an elephant is a much more efficient accumulation of cells than is a muskrat, or a fly. And that's also why elephants have much slower metabolisms than, say, mice. And whereas socioeconomic systems scale exponentially. And so to bring it back to this thing of embedded growth obligations, because what Weinstein talks about when he mentions this is that our societies are structured with an expectation of a growth rate that depends on conditions which are no longer in place or no longer hold. So our expectations for growth are out of line with what our economies can provide. And this is similar to what we talked about in that episode with Jeffrey West, which is that we have socioeconomic systems that demand X amount of growth, that need it, right? To go back to my conversation with Mike Green. And we have underlying economy that can only provide so much, and ecosystems that can only provide so much over X amount of time. And so there's this fundamental incongruency. And I feel like anyone who's remotely thought about these things, and I see it expressed in a lot of these Netflix documentaries, which is why I feel like this virus feels like we're living through like Bird Box or something. Not anymore. Now it's become normal, right? Like now it's normal for me to get the boxes, from the delivery and then wipe them down and do that whole thing. But it feels like, all of us know that there's something, and I'm curious what you think of this, but it feels like there's something fundamentally broken in the way in which we prioritize goods, labor, capital, and resources in our economy.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think probably first encountered this concept on your podcast, or it became clear to me. And just the very fact of pensions, they have a literal embedded growth obligation that's encoded into their mandate. Mm-hmm. That's people's savings. And when it becomes clear they're not going to meet that, that means a meaningful fraction of the population, their long-term prospects in terms of retirement have been cut in half or whatever it is. That's obviously part of the cult of passive investment, this Ponzi-like view that, the stock market can just naturally provide a return. And then if you go back to first principles, you try and decompose that return into its constituent parts. It comes from population growth and productivity growth. We're looking into the face of declining population potentially, or, we need to have really high rates of immigration, for instance, to keep it up. And it doesn't look like productivity is growing all that fast. So you wonder where the return on capital comes from. And increasingly in the last couple of decades, it's just come from financial engineering instead of fundamental actual growth. And you look at asset prices today, you try and rent an apartment or buy a house, in an attractive urban area. It seems totally inaccessible to people starting their careers. I think it causes this widespread sense of hopelessness. And I think people feel it intuitively, even though maybe they haven't intellectually grasped it yet. This fact that we're staring at this prolonged phase of potentially degrowth, and we're not equipped to deal with that. I think this is why we have these really progressive movements demanding more and more entitlements from the government, because people feel that they won't be able to procure them for themselves through their careers. They're asking the government to provide all of these things, which previously they would potentially have been able to acquire on their own. And I do fundamentally believe that we're looking at a couple of decades of just fundamentally shrinkage in terms of our aggregate output. And I don't know if America is, actually capable of dealing with that massive political unrest. Japan sort of went through it, and Japan is very idiosyncratic,
still going through it.
We might look at Japan and say, wow, what they pulled off is actually amazing relative to what could have happened. And maybe they did it in the most elegant way possible. Even though Japan, from an economic perspective, looks catastrophic, relatively speaking, maybe they did it in just about the best way. I don't know if I'm as optimistic for the Japanification of the U.S.
And socially, too. I know it's a different country, but there are a lot of weird social practices there that seem to have evolved during the last few decades. And I wonder how much all these weird sexual practices, not the, panty smelling stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with that. There's a whole thing there. But no, I mean like the disinterest of younger generations in sex. Although that's also the case in South Korea.
But that's got to be related, right? Like if you biologically perceive that your prospects are less, you're going to have a less desire to procreate, right? I don't know which way the causality goes per se. People say, people with worse prospects just structurally try not to have children, or it's this lack of children which causes society to have worse prospects in the aggregate. Who knows? Maybe they're jointly determined. But I certainly buy that demographic transition is probably maybe in part due to the fact that they're staring at this prolonged phase of degrowth. Maybe it's a positive feedback loop. Mm-hmm. And you can certainly see why there's this huge emphasis on immigration in the U.S., not to get into a hot button topic, but it's because growth must be sustained at all costs.
Yeah, immigration is another really interesting topic because it's another example where there's a huge camp of ideologues on the left who have approached this issue assuming that anyone who's against immigration or wants to put curbs on immigration must be coming at it from a sort of bigoted point of view. I'm hoping, and it seems to me that many of these categorical impulses have subsided and maybe in some cases sort of temporarily sought refuge in the last few years because they were really getting out of control and it wasn't doing us much good. But we still have an extremely polarized society, and our media organizations are out of control. When I say media, I'm always talking about the TV stations. They're out of control, man. They're just a fucking joke. None of them can be taken seriously.
I don't think I've ever consciously chosen to tune in to TV news. It's just such an alien concept to me.
It's just so poisonous. It started with Fox News, and it's just become everything. Now it's become CNN, it's become MSNBC, and they've all taken the same tact. I want to ask you one more question because, again, this is a new podcast for me. I had a conversation with Eric Weinstein a few days ago, and he recommended a certain number of episodes to listen to, and I basically binge listened to them. Uh-huh. And I kind of thought about afterwards what the sort of interesting points that he talked about were, or because it felt like that there were a lot of intersections with hidden forces. And there was one other one that I thought a bit about, and I think it's an interesting one to bring up because, when I look at the Bitcoin crypto community, I see it's almost like a mirror to myself 10 years ago when I would never have called myself libertarian, but I really came to sort of default sympathize with or identify with a lot of libertarian or anarchic principles because I had just understandably lost faith in the government, right? My experience with the government my entire adult life has been killing people and taking my money,
Yeah.
And in the years since especially with this show, I've come to appreciate or take the view that there is an important role for government. And one of those places where I feel that's the case is in the sciences. And I did sort of 2 episodes that stand to mind for me or that come to mind that deal with this. And I'm bringing this up because this is something that Eric talks about in a sense, him and Peter Thiel talk about this, right? They talk about how something went wrong between 1968 and 1973, right? Between kind of the moon landings and the oil embargo.
Well, you know what happened bang in the middle of that.
Right, I do. For sure. But see, that's also another interesting point because, again, like the sort of the libertarian people, gold bugs, Bitcoiners, anarchists, I think they ascribe a tremendous amount of responsibility to the monetary story. And I think it's important. And I used to ascribe a lot of value to that too. But again, I think it's more complicated. But yes, 71 and 73, he closed the gold window. Have you seen that video on YouTube, Nick? We're going to find it right now, where Nixon closes the gold window and there's a guy talking over and guy laughing or talking over. There's a guy talking over. Have you seen that video?
I haven't.
Oh, man. I wish I could find it without.
Don't never forget that it was meant to be a temporary suspension.
I know, exactly. It was, he was stopping the speculators.
Yeah, of course.
It's funny because I put this in here. I don't want to start playing videos without it actually. But there's this funny video where he's speaking and there's a guy, he's like, those damn speculators. And Nixon's like, keeps talking. He's like, wait, what? Wait, what? Because he realizes he's getting screwed. It's funny because a video just came up underneath that of one of my old guests on Capital Account. It's actually an episode from his called Doug Casey on Crisis Investing, Political Risk, and Benign Anarchy. But I did an episode with Bill Janeway on the innovation economy, and I did one other one with Safi Bakal, and also another one actually with Jimmy Soni where we talked about Claude Shannon, and inevitably it was basically the history of information theory and a sort of bio of Claude Shannon, and that of course gets into conversations about Bell Labs and Vannevar Bush and the war effort. And a lot of good came out of U.S. government investments. And, like I really have bought into Bill Janeway's thesis around government playing an essential role in the early stages of the innovation cycle where risk is fraught and where the private sector is understandably unwilling to invest because a properly functioning private sector wants to invest efficiently. And so they're really great at extracting value from a foundational technology. But it's not clear to me that the private sector can do a better job, just the total private sector as we conceptualize it, can do a better job creating foundational technologies like the internet protocols, for example, can do a better job than a society which coordinates public funds towards that purpose so that you can have wasteful spending. Because that's what, science is. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I buy the theory. I think you need a patron of some sort that is willing to fund R&D for the sake of it, as opposed to R&D, which is meant to be productized within a meaningful period of time. Whether it's the government is the patron or, like a Rockefeller or Carnegie type. Like, for instance, we have a microcosm of this situation in Bitcoin because people are always wondering how we're going to pay the core developers that build the system, that do the research, work on interesting dimensions in cryptography. And lots of people say, well, there's a failure, it's a tragedy of the commons because this is infrastructure that benefits everyone. And yet, there's no obvious entity which can fund it. So then you'd say, okay, well then, that's a little microcosm for the regular old economy. But then in Bitcoin, you do have patrons, you have entities that just are irrationally committed to the security and the longevity of the protocol, which fund this open source work. So you have patrons in that space. And whether it's the government that's the patron more generally, or you have a environment which lends itself to patronage. So I would say to some degree, that's what Silicon Valley is. I think Silicon Valley, I don't think it's like purely capitalistic. I think there is a degree of wasteful expenditure in a good way, in that you have all sorts of interesting experiments which get funded just because there's so much capital in that environment. There's so many rich, former entrepreneurs which are willing to be angel investors and so on. I think that's part of the reason some of these experiments happen. You just have such a high frequency of collisions and so much capital and founders floating around. That's why there really are network effects for these capital centers. But yeah, that's definitely a critique that folks like Thiel have of the VC model. that we don't have fundamental breakthroughs. Bitcoiners or Austrians would ascribe it to monetary policy. That sounds wacky, but that's certainly held up as the reason that we all have a short time preference now. I don't know if you can, strictly speaking, plan to have a highly innovative society. It seems like the conditions just have to be right. It's not like, for instance, Israel decided to be super accomplished in cybersecurity and defense technology. I think they, developed those competency out of necessity because there was constantly a threat of war. And they had to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and build an advanced society just to survive.
Totally.
And yeah, it might be the case that, the last truly good and beautiful military plane in the US, in my opinion, was the SR-71 Blackbird. Are we going to get some? Would that be built today? Of course not. Because partially that was built just for the sheer amazement of a vehicle that could go Mach 3 and outrun a surface-to-air missile, just to display dominance of the Soviet Union. So it could fly over the Soviet Union with complete impunity. Would we do something like that today? Of course not. We would have an appropriations committee and say, what's our ROI on this?
Amazing.
I don't think we would develop anything like that today, unfortunately.
What an amazing...
Everything is... Yeah, I read this book, Skunk Works, recently, which is about the development of that plane.
Why does that word sound familiar? The book,
Skunk Works
was called Skunk Works?
Yeah, but so that was the name of the lab, the secret lab at Lockheed Martin. Oh. And then that became a general word, meaning, a secret R&D lab.
Wow, here's the book, Skunk Works, 759 5-star reviews.
Yeah, highly...
Wow.
Yeah, add mine into the mix. It's really great.
Wow, that looks amazing.
We don't have Skunk Workses anymore. That was a division of Lockheed that got carte blanche to develop stealth technology, planes like the SR-71, which required a whole bunch of new techniques because it was built out of titanium alloys, which nobody knew how to build things with, needed new advancements and engines. It was just impossible. They built it with slide rules. They didn't even really have computers at that time.
So this plane was used to not just... Well, I don't know that it was used over Cuba to take those spy satellites, or no, because that would have been... It was developed after... Well, it was developed after the Cuban Missile Crisis, wasn't it? Wasn't it developed in the late 60s?
It was developed, I believe...
No, 1964 was
right.
its first flight. I'm looking right now.
It was the U-2 spy plane which got those photos in Cuba. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So the U-2 had... Its strategy was just to fly super high and avoid the surface-to-air missiles and avoid MiG fighters. And then the SR-71 strategy was to be able to outrun everything else in the sky.
Freaking amazing.
So if you shot a missile at this thing, it would just accelerate, and that's it.
Amazing. How quickly, because they did obviously reconnaissance over the USSR, so where would it leave from? And could it do a full flight without mid-air refueling, or did it need mid-air refueling?
No, it was very expensive. It did need mid-air refueling, so they would use it over Korea or China, and they would have 2 refuelings on one flight. They might take off from the Philippines, refuel right away after takeoff, and then do a sortie.
Wow, man.
It was an amazing time in aviation. It really was. And we don't have anything like that. The pilots, like the U-2 pilots, they had to use sextants to navigate, so stars to navigate their planes, because they couldn't have radio because the Soviets would have intercepted that. So they do these 9 to 12 hour journeys solo over the Soviet Union, taking pictures, flying at 80,000 feet, navigating by the stars, and they'd be out of gas when they got out of the Soviet Union. They'd land at some remote airfield in Iraq or Kazakhstan or something. And if they were off by a couple degrees, they would crash land, in Pakistan or something. It was just an amazing time.
God, even by today's standards, the Blackbird looks futuristic. I'm just staring at its gorgeous engines.
It's a wonder. It really is a marvel. And there's one at the Udvar Hazy Air and Space Museum in Ruston, Virginia, where I go as often as I can. Mm-hmm. And it's just the most beautiful plane.
It absolutely
From
is.
the front, the profile is amazing. And who put an end to the program was Dick Cheney in the 90s. He said it wasn't worth it. and we could just rely on satellites.
He was right.
Probably, but it's a shame because it's just an object of wonder,
But like, this is a really, so I thought about this after, because I really liked that episode with Peter Thiel and Eric Weinstein. I was like really, really taken in by it. And I thought about when he said that, when he made the point about something between 1968 or 69 and 73, I thought about Space Odyssey 2001. And 2001 Space Odyssey, I think, was 1968, right? Space Odyssey.
That sounds right.
2001. Yeah. I mean, that is one of my favorite, if not my favorite movie ever made. Have you seen the movie?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how you feel about
beautiful.
it. Yeah, dude, incredible. And this was made at the very end of that period. And what was the expectation? That by 2001, we would have commercial flights to the moon.
Yeah.
Right? And it was really beautifully done. And it's understandable that we had this idea. And, to the point that Janeway's made before, and, Weinstein said something analogous, which was that if you walk into a modern room today and you take out all the screens, it's hard to tell whether you're here or in 1973. What are the major breakthroughs? What are the major advances? And, it makes you wonder if we were able to come together as and this is the argument, this is an example of why the sort of mindless economic orthodoxy arguments for globalization, they're like lobotomized arguments. They're they don't take in the whole panoply, because they don't consider that there are larger things at stake. So it's much harder to advance sort of society-wide agendas that aren't purely economically driven if you have an international conglomerate sort of society, as opposed to having nationalistic, societies with much more tightly knitted social fabrics. You can come to greater social consensus. It's why the Danes were able to create such a well-working welfare state until the 70s or whatever. So, imagine what we would be able to create, where we would be able to go if we could mobilize national resources towards some non-efficient end, because we thought about the long term, right? Like, do we want to? I mean, the Bostrom and the Future of Humanity Institute, right?
Yeah.
I think asteroids are one of their top existential risks, right? Asteroid impacts. Is it worth it? It seems to me maybe it is, to devote resources to that's a global problem. But there are things that I think certainly rich people on the planet would be willing to invest in, right?
Yeah, and symbolically, I think it matters as well.
Sure, man, 100%.
To have this feeling of progress, whereas right now we effectively have a feeling of regression. And if you don't have these totems
or stagnation
of your significance and your achievement, I think it's easy to become disillusioned as a society. And what we've seen over the last, 3-4 decades is, it's much more convenient to pay McKinsey to tell you to outsource your supply chain than it is to invest in R&D or local staff or, local factories. And now we have this super fragile, very homogenized kind of global world, which can't tolerate any shocks whatsoever, and where we haven't had any fundamental investment in R&D. So this is like one reason, I'm not to bring it back to crypto, but this is one reason I'm attracted to Bitcoin, is because it's like this highly collaborative, very opinionated, edifice, which probably shouldn't exist, probably should have failed, a number of times over. And the fact that it's open source and voluntary, and it brings a lot of people together in pursuit of a single objective, it kind of reminds me of those great projects of yore, of the pyramids and all these other, really difficult edifices that were constructed kind of for the sake of it almost. And it gives you something to look forward to, and it restores a small sense of wonder to the world. I think we need a lot more of that if we're going to be able to get through this next phase.
Amen. Let me ask you something in closing, because you just really got my heart, set my heart aflutter with this Skunkworks book and this conversation, man. A book I've mentioned a few times on the show is Gene Kranz's Failure is Not an Option. I went through this phase where Gene Kranz was the head of mission control during a number of Mercury missions and all the way to Apollo 13, famously. He was played
Right.
by Ed Harris in Apollo 13. Amazing book. Also, I went through this phase where I read a lot of these books from that era. I also read this
Yeah.
book that I really loved by Roger Mudd. Roger Mudd is no longer alive. He was in the running to take over the CBS Evening News desk after Cronkite. He lost it to Rather, and then he transferred over, and I think he was at NBC, and he headed the NBC Evening News for a period of time. And I heard that as an audiobook and also read it, but I heard it as an audiobook. He has this gruff news voice, you know? And it
Right.
started with his time working at like a Dallas newspaper in the 50s, I think, or 40s, 50s. And, you know, the news people back then were all blue collar. I also read Barbara Walters' memoir. Amazing, you know? And I kind of sometimes, you know, I worry about this thing where we look back at the past and we eulogize it. And,
Yeah.
you know, that can't be right, right? There was so much wrong with that period. And we also, the thing we don't think about is the terror of living in an age of uncertainty around nuclear warfare, the immense levels of segregation and racism in all of the country, but the segregation particularly in the Jim Crow South. There are lots of things that were really bad about the country. But, you know, I think it's interesting, and I don't know what it is, if it's just because now we got through it and we know we did all these things back then, but it feels like it's more than that, right? Like it feels like America was really great. And people I know that lived that are old enough to remember the time, both Americans and people in Europe. You know, Europeans used to love Americans. They used to love Americans,
Yeah.
man. They wanted to be like America. Like if you look at old Greek movies, they used to do the American accent. Like, you know, they they would do the American accent, like, and, you know, they would try to say words like Americans, or America was the great country.
And that's what we can't take is the humiliation of not living up to that track
Is that what it
record.
is, do you think? Is that what we're dealing with?
I mean, look at the British spirit as well. They went from having the largest empire the world has ever seen to shrinking back to being one relatively small island with a few tiny protectorates. And that's totally reflected in the British spirit. As a Brit, someone who's lived in Britain, that's totally part of the British esteem. And I would forecast that Americans are going to go through the exact same transformation. It's totally humiliating to be a former empire.
Totally.
And we're at that crossroads right now.
But we haven't reached that point yet, though.
No, we're still the global superpower,
Right.
although that's increasingly being questioned. Literally, it's changing on a monthly basis now. You know, alliances are being renegotiated. China's asserting themselves. Our institutional grip is declining.
Yeah, the Soviets went through something like that, very traumatic. But do you think that we're, you know, something I mentioned in an episode, and it wasn't just with them, but I titled it Market Nihilism, the episode I did with, where I had Grant Williams and Ben Hunt together. And I don't know, man, I can't shake this feeling that there's an increase in nihilism. And maybe it's because I feel it in myself a little bit too. And you know where I feel it also, Nick? I feel it with this virus. There's like a
Yeah.
part of me that's kind of like, just burn it all down. I get that feeling sometimes. Do you ever get that
Yeah.
feeling?
Of course, if you're a young male in the year 2020, that's probably your default feeling.
So interesting.
Yeah, and it's a sign of a society in decline, I think, where your best prospects come if there's a collapse. That's what they have a word for it. It's collapsitarian, right?
That's so interesting.
Why do you think that zombie movies were so prevalent in pop culture? That's the thing you had to look forward to, was a shakeup in hierarchies.
You know, I have a friend who is younger than you. I'm 38. You're 28?
Just, yeah, thereabouts.
He is like, I think, 25. And he's a very kind of curious kid. And, you know, he sends me all sorts of interesting items or memes or, you know, trending topics or perspectives that come from his community of young men or boys that inhabit a lot of the online forums on Reddit or Twitter or wherever. And it is really fascinating, man. I mean, the classic example is like the OK Boomer or the Boomer meme.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think for people like my parents' generation, they have no clue about this. They don't understand how serious it is, how serious it's gotten, right? The inequity. Because they're
the
boomers.
beneficiaries.
Yeah.
They're the beneficiaries of this currently stratified society, which is, people may not be looking at those charts of the Gini coefficient and which demographic cohort holds which financial assets, but they feel it. And secretly they yearn for a collapse, which is why the reflation of the bubble is making people so angry, myself included, because it is robbing society of a chance to reset. And if we don't get it now, we're going to get a jubilee or something politically shake up. I think there's basically a law here where if society doesn't let that stratification be remediated in some way or another, that's the stuff the revolutions are made of.
Dude, it's so true. I don't know what form it will take, if it will work, but I mean, Bitcoin is an indictment of the modern financial system and the failure of government. When I say Bitcoin, let me rephrase that. The force behind Bitcoin, the incredible force behind the Bitcoin project, the determination by so many people to circumvent the modern financial system that is supported by the United States government, by governments all over the world, and which is a public-private partnership between the government and the key financial intermediaries and institutions. And this is exactly what it is. It is there to serve.
Protest.
Exactly.
It's a nonviolent protest. That's precisely what it is. It's a political project. It's technological, but it's mostly political.
So give me some books, before we end this conversation, give me some books that you like. You just recommended a fantastic one that I'm going to order. Is this author still alive? This guy, Ben Rich, looks like he's been dead for years. He looks like he wrote this in 1984. He looks like he wrote this book. Let me see.
He was like the second guy that ran the Skunk Works behind Kelly Johnson.
Dude, this guy's alive.
He's still alive. Yeah,
he was born in 1925. He's still alive.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Wow.
Highly recommended.
Man, these guys, bro. Like my grandfather, man, who fought in World War II.
Let me see. What else am I reading right now? I have a personal interest in the Caucasus and, the Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. So there's this great history of the Caucasus that I'm reading by Thomas DeWall. Not that that's of general interest.
That's interesting. Thomas DeWall. How do you spell his last name?
DeWall, D-E space W-A-A-L.
W-A-A-L.
And it's the most fascinating part
Black Garden.
It's where, yeah, that's right. Black Garden is Nagorno-Karabakh.
Also,
the
Caucasus. The Caucasus is an introduction. Have you read Mark Mazawar?
No, I haven't.
He wrote an introduction of the Balkans. He's a Balkan historian. He's written Salonika, City of Ghosts, which was a history of in part, the Jewish exodus from Thessaloniki, which was a Greek cosmopolitan city during World War II because of the Nazi invasion. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan is one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union. These were nationalist, enclaves which had been dormant since effectively Stalin actually redistricted them. And you had this simmering resentment, which grew and grew, but it couldn't express itself. It was illegal to protest. And then in 1989, people got mad enough. They actually started doing pogroms and, killing each other in large numbers. And this simmering nationalistic sentiment exploded, started a civil war. And that catalyzed every other little ethnic unit in the Soviet Union to say, well, if they can do it, we can do it too. It's a great case study in how systems look stable, but they're becoming increasingly unstable over time.
That's fascinating, man. What other books can you recommend?
I like to write a lot, as you know, and I'm reading this great book about writing by one of my favorite writers, Murakami.
How do you spell that?
It's spelled the way it sounds.
Murakami,
Haruki Murakami. Yeah, he's a fiction author.
The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle?
Yeah, the Wind-Up Bird. Yeah, that's one of his books. So the one I'm reading is ostensibly a book about running, but it's really about writing. So it's about how the rigor of being a runner, a serious runner, enabled him to become a much better writer.
What I talk about when I talk about running.
Yeah, so it's a really great book, both about writing and about running, both of which I do. So it's perfect. And he lived in Cambridge, where I'm based most of the time. So
Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Dude, give me one more book. This is great.
Let me see. What else do I have on my bookshelf right now?
This is so different than what I've been reading lately. Although the book on the Caucasus would be something that I used to read a lot of history and I loved it. but it's so hard to do anything other than read stuff that's relevant to the shows these days.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if your listener base would like this recommendation, but I just finished rereading Bronze Age Mindset, which is a really popular book these days on, probably on the right, I would say.
Really? What is this? Bronze Age Mindset by Bronze Age Pervert?
Yeah, it's by Bronze Age Pervert.
What is that? It's the book right after it is The Pussy by Delicious Tacos.
Also a great book. So Bronze Age Mindset is basically written in this strange patois, like this slang, and the author is pseudonymous, obviously, and it's just about philosophy and life, and it's basically an indictment of modern culture, modern life. So it's kind of, you might say it's neo-reactionary, but it's just, a kind of a rambling book, but also weirdly very compelling.
It says this so interesting. The Atlantic named this author as possibly Steve Bannon's contact in the White House.
Yeah, I think that was a joke, but yeah, it's all related. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting, entertaining read.
I was when I was getting inspired recently, because I've been going a little crazy here. I don't know who you're cooped up with, but I'm cooped up with a lot of people. My girlfriend, my sister, her boyfriend, my parents. But it's fine. When I say cooped up, we're all in the same house, and it's actually nice. We're in a super rural area. And I went for a drive, and I was feeling kind of ambitious. And I had some space, which rarely happens. And I was like, I really want to spend more time studying the progressive period, really the beginning of the progressive era with what was going on in the Midwestern farm regions, and then all the way through until the coming of FDR. And, doesn't seem like there are that many books. There were less than I thought, but I downloaded this one, and I didn't get to read much more than a few hours worth of it, but it was Richard Hofstadter's The Age of Reform, which is a history of the progressive movement. But that stuff's fascinating, because I think that's relevant to kind of where we are today,
That's where we're going. That's what Chamath said. He said that in his note.
Chamath is the guy that Social Capital.
Yeah, he wrote the best investor letter. He says, we're in the Gilded Age, we're in the robber baron age, and we're going to move into the progressive age now. And it's not going to be a peaceful transition, but that's where we're going. And I totally buy that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, unless, what if, we could have moved into the progressive era in Germany. Dude, when I'm talking about, obviously, the rise of Hitler's Germany.
Yeah, well, maybe we're in the Weimar Republic in the early stages now.
Yeah, because, that was also, to go back to Weinstein, probably the most interesting thing from that conversation was Weinstein and Thiel talking about the history of the Jews in Germany and what was lost with the exodus or extermination of millions of Jewish citizens from Germany. Some of the most intellectually vibrant, culturally and artistically gifted members of the community. And he had this great scene that Weinstein talks about where he's in a restaurant in Germany in like the 80s or the 90s or something. And he couldn't communicate with the staff. And then he wanted a fork. And he threw out the Yiddish word for fork. Yeah. And the waiter brought him a fork. And he was like, it was this weird moment of kind of feeling like, this is where somehow belong here, but not really. And something I never thought about, right? Which is what Germany could have been, right? If it hadn't gone insane.
Yeah. Not just Germany, yeah. Poland, virtually all of their Jewish population was eradicated.
Yeah. And Austria. But I just mean Germany and Austria because it was the sort of the epicenter of intellectual thought. If you wanted to be a great philosopher in the early 1900s or an intellectual, you had to speak German.
It's similar in some ways to China's Cultural Revolution. What could China have been if they didn't purge their entire intellectual class?
Jesus, man.
You think about the setback that is for a society. Your entire urban elite intellectual and academic class all purged in the space of a few years.
Man, unreal.
Yeah, I hope we don't have one here, But there's certainly plenty of anti-intellectualism to go around.
There is, though I don't know. There are people that try to compare us to Nazi Germany because they see Trump as Hitler, which I think is totally unjustified and almost hilarious.
But we also don't have the ability to mobilize on a mass scale. That's just not in the DNA of the country. America is more individualist by degree. So it resists large-scale political movements.
That's so interesting. No,
it would sooner
totally
fragment, than enter one of these political manias.
No, totally. And if anything, it's got quite the opposite problem. It's not blaming. It has no clear enemy other than the actual dominant majority, which is the white man. That's been the sort of the major narrative, identity narrative of focus. Right. I have no idea how this came out for listeners, but it was interesting talking to you, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, dude.
This is great.
Yeah, it was fun talking. I'm envious of your reading list, Nick.
I was getting to the end of my tether there. I was running out of books on my nightstand. I didn't bring that many books with me from Boston.
Well, I mean, the cool thing is that you're in a space. When I say a space, I mean headspace, where you have a lot of space to write and reflect. You have one focus. And when I say one focus, I mean, you're focused on crypto economics, but it's all part of, some kind of working through ideas. And as opposed to me, where there was a time where I was in that space, but now I just kind of every week I have to focus on someone else's ideas.
Right.
And it doesn't give me the time, and that's valuable, but at some point I've got to stop that because I miss...
Yeah, because you can't go deep in anything specifically.
Yeah. Or I can't go deep in a way that feels authentic. Like I can try to go as deep as I can for the benefit of others and for my own learning, but I can never integrate that back into the larger whole and come up with something, unique insight that's mine,
I was just thinking about this because people keep pushing me to write a book, but I actually also feel the same thing because, my obligation is to the daily needs of our startups and our portfolio. I think it might be those public equity investors that have a lot of time to reflect on history. Although maybe everyone
You mean the macro
thinks
guys?
everyone, yeah, because you read their notes, it's always about history. I'm always so envious of them
because they're always trying to figure out what the world is going to look like. That's how they are.
Where we are in history. You read the Howard Marks stuff. It's all historical references.
Totally.
But maybe that's just this universal feeling that everybody else has more time than you.
No. I think it's true. I mean, because I used to have so much more time. My life used to be structured in a very different way. But that's fine. I mean, I'm happy with what my life is now. I like getting to do this. I wanted this. I constructed my life this way. It's a great privilege to get a chance to talk to folks like you or all sorts of other people that come on the show and to be exposed to your different perspectives, which is why, to go back to something we talked about at the beginning, I genuinely, the thing for me that matters is having open, honest conversations from a place of good faith. And because there's so much to gain for me, and I think for listeners, dude, like I told you, by the time this episode airs or this, overtime thing goes out, we're at 995 paid subscribers right now. So it might be 1,000. It's working. The experiment's working. People really want it. And even, everyone does sponsors, but, I haven't gone that route. And I've been so inspired by the willingness and even enthusiasm of everyday people to literally buy into this model,
Yeah, it's very unique. Yeah, you could have, landed some extremely fat sponsorship deals, but this way is much more independent. It's much better.
Yeah, I don't want to have to do that. I don't understand why some people do it. I see some people who I know have a lot of money and they still do sponsors. And I almost think, I don't know why they do it. I think it's just mechanical for some people. They just do it because it's mechanical. Because there's got to be, a lot of people don't need to make that extra money.
And it also cheapens the content because then you just have to produce output, and you're not doing it for the sake of the interview itself. You're doing it to fill a slot.
Yeah, the worst is when they're doing it and they're interrupting. If we're talking and all of a sudden it's I can't even do it, castor oil. So, but the last thing I want to do is put someone else's words in my mouth.
Yeah.
But I understand that, I totally get that everyone's got different needs and I get it. And I think there are ways to do it that, aren't bad, like the classic example, like audible.com, Audible, audio that speaks to you wherever you are, and just go right back, Or, if I had an Audible as a sponsor and it was right at the top of the show, it's not a big deal. But I'd really rather not,
They're one of the few sponsors where I actually went out and bought the product after, they sponsored some YouTube videos that I was watching. So I guess it's working.
Totally. There was only one sponsor that I had considered having on as a sponsor, I think. Yeah. Because I also thought about Masterclass, but I was like, Yeah. It was the Great Courses, because I really like the Great Courses. But my proposal to them, they wanted to do a strict kind of regular sponsorship model.
Right.
Whereas I said, look, I have listened to so many of your lectures. Let me bring on some of the authors that I really like, and let me do a full episode with them. And, we can give a percentage off to anyone who buys that lecture, and you can give me a piece of that,
Yeah.
And I'll be an enthusiastic supporter because I like the product. But, and I get it. They have their own things. Anyway, Nick, we've recorded for almost 2 hours.
Yeah.
So thanks, man. It was great having you on. And I'll send this to my editor, who is he doesn't have much else to do right now because he's cooped up at home.
Yeah.
So he'll probably be happy to work through this.
Well, thank you
and we'll get it out as soon as possible.
Thanks for having me on again. It's a pleasure. Hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, man. It's great having you on. Okay. Peace. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.